Hi, I hope you'll join me today in painting this blue floral watercolor planter. And let me show you everything I'll be using today to create this blue floral planter. I have my SeimiArt and Sonnet watercolors, my watercolor palette, 2 jars of water, and my Intuition size 6 flat and size 6 round brushes. I also have my 350 GSM watercolor paper from Dollar Tree and a clean cloth for dabbing up any mistakes or blotting any brushes. Let's get started. I started by penciling a rough outline of the flower planter. I wanted it a little wider at the top. And then I heavily wet the areas to the sides and below the planter, and then loosely going up to the top of the paper and above the planter around the area that will be florals. I just loosely wetted that, and then I dropped in this periwinkle kind of pigment. Now I wanted to make sure I had really full coverage, but a loose wash to the sides and below the planter. But above the planter and in where the florals would be, I was able to do that with just a lighter hand and a bit more randomness. So I just dropped the pigment in here and there. I brushed just a little bit, and then I did kind of blend to the outside for a decent border, not really wanting it to be too defined or anything. And then I did go back in and drop a bit more pigment below where the planter is going to be for a natural shadow. So now I'm just taking the pigment that I'm using for my pink florals, and I'm dotting in these floral centers. Where the background is a little wet, it's bleeding a bit and spreading, and that is okay. And then I'm going to take plain water, as I often do. This is my favorite technique for florals. And I'm just getting my brush wet with the clean water, and then I'm going in and creating petal shapes into those floral centers. That lets that pigment just start spreading into the water that I brush in. It creates these beautiful, dreamy, soft florals. So I just love that. And I just keep doing that, rinsing my brush, getting clean water, brushing in those petals. And don't worry too much about this being a perfect petal shape or a perfect floral shape, because honestly, I'm just going for the idea of florals. I'm going for the idea of petals. So if this resembles that, I'm perfectly happy. I'm also paying attention to composition because I do want some yellow flowers coming out of the top of this. And then I take a little bit of this periwinkle blue and I just go in kind of between the bottoms of those flowers and create the top of that planter shape. So now I'm taking my yellow pigment, and because I want these yellow flowers to be kind of a filler flower and small, I'm just going to dot some of this yellow pigment, and I'm just dotting it kind of over to the left and then kind of in the center and a little bit to the right. And I'm not really worried about any of the pigments bleeding together. I actually like that, and at this point some of those things may still be a little wet and will kind of bleed together. I don't want them to overly bleed together, but a little bit is fine. And then I'm taking my clean water again, and I'm just dotting in and around those dots of pigment. So I'm trying not to overwork it. I don't want the pigments all to just rush together in one puddle of water, but I do want them to create some dimension and depth, so I want some light pigment and some deep pigment. And a great way to do that is just touching it with some clean water. It will bleed some into that, but then you'll also retain some of that deeper pigment. And now I'm also taking a very light wash of my pink and making some petals in the background. And now I want to add some leaves and stems, so I'm just going in with my olive green and making some little stems. Inside, I want them in between some of these flowers, and I want to drop in some leaves. I don't mind if they overlap the planter to some degree. I can have some difficulty myself with leaf placement. It just tends to be a challenge for me, so I really honestly just try not to overthink it and to stay very relaxed when placing my leaves. I also can have a tendency to be very symmetric and go from one side to another, which to some degree is good because it helps to balance out the tones and the depth, but it can also be problematic because it can be a little matchy-matchy. So I just try to steer clear of that. I want to balance my deep greens and my light greens a little bit. I don't want just one area that's very dark and one area that's very light. So while it can be tricky, I just try to make sure that I'm not mirroring the same things on each side. And now I'm making sure that there's some little stems and these little yellow flowers. And then I'll go in a minute with some lighter greens. Now I just want to add some variety in my greens, so I'm going in with a lighter wash of this olive mixed with a little bit of the yellow, and I'm just creating these little multi-leaf stems and branches kind of going out of this bouquet. And these are just kind of a curvy line with a leaf on the end and then leaves going up the sides of those. And I'm just creating those here and there where I think that they would be appropriate. And it's a great idea to mix your green with another tone that you have in your arrangement or in your composition. That's a great way to get some variety in color, but also to make sure that your colors are cohesive, that they still look well together, that color theory still comes into play. And so I'm fleshing this out with some more of those leaves and just sometimes an individual leaf here and there, and brushing some inside the arrangement as well, in between some flowers here and there. It can be a leaf shape or it can just be kind of a brush stroke, but it's kind of blending that all together. Now I wanted to add some pattern to my planter, so I took the same periwinkle pigment and I just started creating these flourishy little leaves and stems. So I would just paint these curvy lines, these swirly kind of lines, and brush petal shapes off of those. I did not expect this to be quite so time consuming, and for me it kind of was, so I will spare you that and speed this up, and I'll also cut some of this out probably, but in any case I just kind of wanted to alternate the direction of these and where they were coming from, but kind of flesh out an entire pattern. And I actually really love how it turned out. It was very fun. It just took a little more time than I expected. One other thing that I did was I took an extremely light wash of my Payne's Gray and I made this very subtle shadow just beneath the rim of the planter and then down one side of the planter. Again, this was just very, very light, but I felt it needed that depth and dimension. So now the last step in this painting was adding a shadow to the bottom of the planter. I went in with my Payne's Gray and just added a solid line right beneath it and touching the very bottom of the planter. And then I went back with a rinsed brush and just kind of loosely brushed that out into a bit more of a diffused shadow there. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you'll try it. Please leave me a comment if you try it and let me know how it goes. As always, happy painting!